Chapter 2: The Efficiency Trap. Let's begin with busyness. It isn't our only time problem, and it isn't everyone's problem, but it's a uniquely vivid illustration of the effort we invest in fighting against our built-in limitations, thanks to how normal it has become to feel as though you absolutely must do more than you can do. Busyness is a misnomer for this state of affairs, really because certain forms of busyness can be delightful. Who wouldn't want to live in Busy Town, the setting of the iconic 1960s children's books by the American illustrator Richard Scarry? His grocer cats and firefighting pigs are certainly busy. Nobody in Busy Town is idle, or if they are, they're carefully hidden from view by the authorities. Pyongyang style. What they aren't, though, is overwhelmed. They exude the cheery self-possession of cats and pigs who have plenty to do, but also every confidence that their tasks will fit snugly into the hours available. Whereas we live with the constant anxiety of fearing or knowing for certain that ours won't. Research shows that this feeling arises on every rung of the economic ladder. If you're working 2 minimum wage jobs to put food in your children's stomachs, there's a good chance you'll feel overstretched. But if you're better off, you'll find yourself feeling overstretched for reasons that seem, to you, no less compelling. Because you have a nicer house with higher mortgage payments, or because the demands of your interesting, well-paid job conflicts with your longing need to spend time with your aging parents, or to be more involved in your children's lives, or to dedicate your life to fighting climate change. As the law professor Daniel Markovits has shown, even the winners in our achievement-obsessed culture, the ones who make it to the elite universities, then reap the highest salaries, find that their reward is the unending pressure to work with crushing intensity in order to maintain the income and status that have come to seem like prerequisites for the lives they want to lead. It's not just that the situation feels impossible. In strictly logical terms, it really is impossible. It can't be the case that you must do more than you can do. That notion doesn't make any sense. If you truly don't have time for everything you want to do, or feel you ought to do, or that others are badgering you to do, then, well, you don't have time, no matter how grave the consequences of failing to do it all might prove to be. So technically, it's irrational to feel troubled by an overwhelming to-do list. You'll do what you can, you won't do what you can't. And the tyrannical inner voice insisting that you must do everything is simply mistaken. We rarely stop to consider things so rationally, though, because that would mean confronting the painful truth of our limitations. We would be forced to acknowledge that there are hard choices to be made, which balls to let drop, which people to disappoint, which cherished ambitions to abandon, which roles to fail at. Maybe you can't keep your current job while also seeing enough of your children. Maybe making sufficient time in the week for your creative calling means you'll never have an especially tidy home or get quite as much exercise as you should, and so on. Instead, in an attempt to avoid these unpleasant truths, we deploy the strategy that dominates most conventional advice on how to deal with busyness. We tell ourselves we'll just have to find a way to do more. To try to address our busyness, you could say, by making ourselves busier still. Sisyphus's inbox. This is a modern reaction to a modern problem, but it is not brand new. In 1908, the English journalist Arnold Bennett published a short and grouchy book of advice, the title of which demonstrated that this anxious effort to fit more in was already afflicting his Edwardian world: How to Live on a 24-Hour Day. Recently, in a daily organ, a battle raged round the question of whether a woman can exist nicely in the country on 85 pounds a year, Bennett wrote. I have also seen an essay, How to Live on 8 shillings a week, but I have never seen an essay, How to Live on 24 hours a day. The joke, to spell it out, is how absurd it is that anyone should need such advice, since nobody has ever had more than 24 hours a day in which to live. Yet people did need it. To Bennett and his target audience, suburban professionals commuting by tran and train to office jobs in England's increasingly prosperous cities, time was starting to feel like a container too small for all of it required to hold. He was writing, he explained, for his companions in distress, that innumerable band of souls who are haunted, more or less painfully, by the feeling that years slip by, and slip by, and slip by, and that they have not yet been able to get their lives into proper working order. His blunt diagnosis was that most people wasted several hours each day, especially in the evenings. They told themselves they were tired when they could just as easily pull up their socks and get on with all the life-enriching activities they claimed they never had time for. What I suggest, wrote Bennett, is that at 6 o'clock you look facts in the face and admit that you are not tired, because you're not, you know. As an alternative strategy, he suggests rising earlier instead. His book even contains instructions on how to brew your own tea in case you're up before the servants. How to Live on 24 Hours a Day is a wonderful, stimulating book, full of practical suggestions that make it well worth reading today. But the whole thing rests on one extremely dubious assumption, apart from the assumption that you have servants, I mean. Like virtually every time management expert who was to come after him, Bennett implies that if you follow his advice, you'll get enough of the genuinely important things done to feel at peace with time. Fit a bit more activity into each day's container, he suggests, and you'll reach the serene and commanding status of finally having enough time. But that wasn't true in 1908, and it's even less true today. This is what I had begun to grasp on the park bench in Brooklyn, and I still think it's the single best antidote to the feeling of time pressure, a splendidly liberating first step on the path of embracing your limits. The problem with trying to make time for everything that feels important, or just for enough of what feels important, is that you definitely never will. The reason isn't that you haven't yet discovered the right time management tricks or applied sufficient effort, or that you need to start getting up earlier, or that you're generally useless. It's that the underlying assumption is unwarranted. There's no reason to believe you'll ever feel on top of things, or make time for everything that matters simply by getting more done. For a start, what matters is subjective. So, you've no grounds for assuming there will be time for everything that you, or your employer, or that your culture happens to deem important. But the other exasperating issue is that if you succeed in fitting more in, you'll find the goalposts start to shift. More things will begin to seem important, meaningful, or obligatory. Acquire a reputation for doing your work at amazing speed, and you'll be given more of it. Your boss isn't stupid. Why would she give the extra work to someone slower? Figure out how to spend enough time with your kids and at the office so you don't feel guilty about either, and you'll suddenly feel some new social pressure to spend more time exercising or to join the parent-teacher association. Oh, and isn't it finally time you learned to meditate? Get around to launching that side business you've dreamed of for years. And if it succeeds, it won't be long before you're no longer satisfied with keeping it small. The same goes for chores. In her book, More Work for Mother, the historian Ruth Schwartz Cohen shows that when housewives first got access to labor-saving devices like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, no time was saved at all because society's standards of cleanliness simply rose to offset the benefits. Now that you could return each of your husband's shirts to a spotless condition after a single wearing, it began to feel like you should to show how much you loved him. Work expands so to fill the time available for its completion. The English humorist and historian C. Northcote Parkinson wrote in 1955, coining what became known as Parkinson's Law. But it's not merely a joke, and it doesn't apply only to work, it applies to everything that needs doing. In fact, it's the definition of what needs doing that expands to fill the time available. This whole painful irony is especially striking in the case of email, that ingenious 20th century invention whereby any random person on the planet can pester you at any time they like and at almost no cost to themselves by means of digital window that sits inches from your nose or in your pocket throughout your working day and often on weekends too. The input side of this arrangement, the number of emails that you could in principle receive, is essentially infinite. But the output side, the number of messages you'll have time to read properly, reply to, or just make a considered decision to delete, is strictly finite. So getting better at processing your email is like getting faster and faster at climbing up an infinitely tall ladder. You'll feel more rushed, but no matter how quickly you go, you'll never reach the top. In ancient Greek myth, the gods punished King Sisyphus for his arrogance by sentencing him to push an enormous boulder up a hill, only to see it roll back down again, and again. an action he is condemned to repeat for all eternity. In the contemporary version, Sisyphus would empty his inbox, lean back, and take a deep breath before hearing a familiar ping. You've got new messages. It gets worse, though, because here the goalpost shifting effects kicks in. Every time you reply to an email, there's a good chance of provoking a reply to that email, which itself may require another reply, and so on, until the heat death of the universe. At the same time, you'll become known as someone who responds promptly to an email, so more people will consider it worth their while to message you to begin with. By contrast, negligent emailers frequently find that forgetting to reply ends up saving them time. People find alternative solutions to the problems they were nagging you to solve, or the looming crisis they were emailing you about never materializes. So it's not simply that you never get through your email, it's that the process of getting through your email actually generates more email. The general principle in operation is one you might call the efficiency trap, rendering yourself more efficient either by implementing various productivity techniques or by driving yourself harder. Won't generally result in feeling of having enough time because all else being equal, the demands will increase to offset any benefits. Far from getting things done, you'll be creating new things to do. For most of us, most of the time, it isn't feasible to avoid the efficiency trap altogether. After all, few of us are in a position not to attempt to get through our email, even if the consequence is that we receive more email. The same applies to life's other responsibilities too. We're often obligated to find ways to cram more into the same amount of time, even if we end up feeling busier as a result. Likewise, Schwartz-Cohen's early 20th century housewives presumably felt that they couldn't defy the social pressure toward ever tidier and cleaner homes. So I don't mean to imply that once you grasp what's going on here, you'll magically never feel busy again. But the choice you can make is to stop believing you'll ever solve the challenge of busyness by cramming more in, because that just makes matters worse. And once you stop investing in the idea that you might one day achieve peace of mind that way, it becomes easier to find peace of mind in the present, in the midst of overwhelming demands, because you're no longer making your peace of mind dependent on dealing with all the demands. Once you stop believing that, it might be somehow possible to avoid hard choices about time. It gets easier to make better ones. You begin to grasp that when there's too much to do, and there always will be, the only route to psychological freedom is to let go of the limit-denying fantasy of getting it all done, and instead to focus on doing a few things that count. The bottomless bucket list. All this talk of inboxes and washing machines risks giving the impression that feeling overwhelmed is solely a matter of having too much to do at the office or around the house. But there's a deeper sense in which merely to be alive on the planet today is to be haunted by the feeling of having too much to do. Whether or not you lead a busy life in any conventional sense, think of it as existential overwhelm. The modern world provides an inexhaustible supply of things that seem worth doing, and so there arises an inevitable and unbridgeable gap between what you'd ideally like to do and what you actually can do. As the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa explains, pre-modern people weren't much troubled by such thoughts, partly because they believed in an afterlife. There was no particular pressure to get the most out of it, their limited time, because as far as they were concerned, it wasn't limited. And in any case, earthly life was but a relatively insignificant prelude to the most important part. They also tended to see the world as unchanging through history, or in some cultures, as cycling repeatedly through the same predictable stages. It felt like a known quantity. You were content to play a role in the human drama, a role that countless thousands had played before you, and thousands more would play after your death, without any sense that you were missing out on exciting new possibilities of your particular moment in history. In an unchanging or cyclical view of history, there never are any exciting new possibilities. But secular modernity changes all that. When people stop believing in an afterlife, everything depends on making the most of this life. And when people start believing in progress and the idea that history is headed toward an ever more perfect future, they feel far more acutely the pain of their own little lifespan, which condemns them to missing out on almost all of that future. And so they try to quell their anxieties by cramming their lives with experience. In his translator's introduction to Rosa's book, Social Acceleration, Jonathan Trejo Matthees writes, "The more we can accelerate our ability to go to different places, see new things, try new foods, embrace various forms of spirituality, learn new activities, share sensual pleasures with others, whether it be in dancing or sex, experience different forms of art, and so on, the less incongruence there is between the possibilities of experience we can realize in our own lifetimes and the total array of possibilities available to human beings now and in the future. That is, the closer we come to having a truly fulfilled life, in the literal sense of one that is as filled full of experiences as it can possibly be." So the retiree ticking exotic destinations off a bucket list and the hedonist stuffing her weekends full of fun are arguably just as overwhelmed as the exhausted social worker or corporate lawyer. It's true that the things by which they're being overwhelmed are nominally more enjoyable. It's certainly nicer to have a long list of Greek islands left to visit than a long list of homeless families left to find housing for, or a huge stack of contracts left to proofread, but it remains the case that their fulfillment still seems to depend on their managing to do more than they can do. This helps explain why stuffing your life with pleasurable activities so often proves less satisfying than you'd expect. It's an attempt to devour the experiences the world has to offer, to feel like you've truly lived, but the world has an effectively infinite number of experiences to offer, so getting a handful of them under your belt brings you no closer to a sense of having feasted on life's possibilities. Instead, you find yourself pitched straight back into the efficiency trap. The more wonderful experiences you succeed in having, the more additional wonderful experiences you start to feel you could have had, or ought to have, on top of all those you've already had, with the result that the feeling of existential overwhelm gets worse. Perhaps it goes without saying that the internet makes this all much more agonizing, because it promises to help you make better use of your time, while simultaneously exposing you to vastly more potential uses for your time, so that the very tool you're using to get the most out of life makes you feel as though you're missing out on even more of it. Facebook, for example, was an extremely efficient way to stay informed about events you might like to attend, but it's also a guaranteed way to hear about more events you'd like to attend than anyone else possibly could attend. OkCupid is an efficient way of finding people to date, but also of being constantly reminded about all the other potentially more alluring people you might be dating instead. Email is an unparalleled tool for responding rapidly to a large volume of messages, but then again, if it weren't for email, you wouldn't be receiving all those messages in the first place. The technologies we use to try to get on top of everything always fail us in the end because they increase the size of the everything of which we're trying to get on top. Why you should stop clearing the decks. So far, I've been writing as if the efficiency trap were a simple matter of quantity. You have too much to do, so you try to fit more in. But the ironic result is that you end up with more to do. The worst aspect of the trap, though, is that it's also a matter of quality. The harder you struggle to fit everything in, the more of your time you'll find yourself spending on the least meaningful things. Adopt an ultra-ambitious time management system that promises to take care of your entire to-do list, and you probably won't even get around to the most important items on that list. Dedicate your retirement to seeing as much of the world as you possibly can, and you probably won't even get to see the most interesting parts. The reason for this effect is straightforward. The more firmly you believe it ought to be possible to find time for everything, the less pressure you'll feel to ask whether any given activity is the best use for a portion of your time. Whenever you encounter some potential new item for your to-do list or your social calendar, you'll be strongly biased in favor of accepting it because you'll assume you needn't sacrifice any other tasks or opportunities in order to make space for it. Yet because in reality your time is finite, doing anything requires sacrifice, the sacrifice of all the other things you could have been doing with that stretch of time. If you never stop to ask yourself if the sacrifice is worth it, your days will automatically begin to fill not just with more things, but with more trivial or tedious things because they've never had to clear the hurdle of being judged more important than something else. Commonly, these will be things that other people want you to do to make their lives easier, in which you didn't think to try to resist. The more efficient you get, the more you become a limitless reservoir for other people's expectations, in the words of the management expert Jim Benson. In my days as a paid-up productivity geek, it was this aspect of the whole scenario that troubled me the most. Despite my thinking of myself as the kind of person who got things done, it grew painfully clear that the things I got done most diligently were the unimportant ones, while the important ones got postponed, either forever until an immediate deadline forced me to complete them, to a mediocre standard and in a stressful rush. The email from my newspaper's IT department about the importance of regularly changing my password would provoke me to speedy action, though I could have ignored it entirely. The clue was in the subject line, where the words, "Please read," are generally a sign you needn't bother reading what follows. Meanwhile, the long message from an old friend now living in New Delhi, in research for the major article I'd been planning for months, would get ignored because I told myself that such tasks needed my full focus, which meant waiting until I had a good chunk of free time and fewer small but urgent tasks tugging at my attention. And so, instead, like the dutiful and efficient worker I was, I'd put my energy into clearing the decks, cranking through the smaller stuff to get it out of the way, and only to discover that doing so took the whole day, that the decks filled up again overnight anyway, that the moment for responding to the New Delhi email or for researching the milestone article never arrived. One can waste years this way, systematically postponing precisely the things one cares about the most. What's needed instead in such situations, I gradually came to understand, is a kind of anti-skill, not the counterproductive strategy of trying to make yourself more efficient, but rather a willingness to resist such urges, to learn to stay with the anxiety of feeling overwhelmed, of not being on top of everything, without automatically responding by trying to fit more in. To approach your days in this fashion means, instead of clearing the decks, declining to clear the decks, focusing instead on what's truly of greatest consequence, while tolerating the discomfort of knowing that, as you do so, the decks will be filling up further with emails and errands and other to-dos, many of which you may never get around to at all. You'll sometimes still decide to drive yourself hard in an effort to squeeze more in, when circumstances absolutely require it. But that won't be your default mode, because you'll no longer be operating under the illusion of one day making time for everything. The same goes for existential overwhelm. What's required is the will to resist the urge to consume more and more experiences, since that strategy can only lead to the feeling of having even more experience left to consume. Once you truly understand that you're guaranteed to miss out on almost every experience the world has to offer, the fact that there are so many you still haven't experienced stops feeling like a problem. Instead, you get to focus on fully enjoying the tiny slice of experiences you actually do have time for, and the freer you are to choose in each moment what counts the most. The pitfalls of convenience. There's one further, especially insidious way in which the quest for increased efficiency warps our relationship with time these days. The seductive lure of convenience. Entire industries now thrive on the promise of helping us cope with having an overwhelming amount to do by eliminating or accelerating tedious and time-consuming chores. But the result, in an irony that shouldn't be too surprising by now, is that life gets subtly worse. As with other manifestations of the efficiency trap, freeing up time in this fashion backfires in terms of quantity, because the freed up time just fills with more things you feel you have to do. And also in terms of quality, because in attempting to eliminate only the tedious experiences, we accidentally end up eliminating things we didn't realize we valued until they were gone. It works like this. In startup jargon, the way to make a fortune in Silicon Valley is to identify a pain point, one of the small annoyances resulting from more jargon, the friction of daily life, and then to offer a way to circumvent it. Thus, Uber eliminates the pain of having to track down a number for your local taxi company and call it, or trying to hail a cab in the street. Digital wallet apps like Apple Pay remove the pain of having to reach into your bag for your physical wallet or cash. The food delivery service seamlessly has even run advertisements, tongue-in-cheek ones, but still boasting that it lets you avoid the agony of talking to a flesh and blood restaurant worker. Instead, you need only commute with a screen. It's true that everything runs more smoothly this way, but smoothness, it turns out, is a dubious virtue, since it's often the unsmooth textures of life that make it livable, helping nurture the relationships that are crucial for mental and physical health, and for the resilience of our communities. Your loyalty to your local taxi firm is one of those delicate social threads that, multiplied thousands of times, bind a neighborhood together. Your interactions with the woman who runs the nearby Chinese takeout might feel insignificant, but they help make yours the kind of area where people still talk to one another, where tech-induced loneliness doesn't yet reign supreme. Take it from a work-from-home writer. A couple of brief interactions with another human can make all the difference in a day. As for Apple Pay, I like a little friction when I buy something, since it marginally increases the chance that I'll resist a pointless purchase. Convenience, in other words, makes things easy, but without regard to whether easiness is truly what's most valuable in any given context. Take those services on which I've relied too much in recent years that let you design and then remotely mail a birthday card, so you never see or touch the physical item yourself. Better than nothing, perhaps, but sender and recipient both know that it's a poor substitute for purchasing a card in a shop, writing on it by hand, and then walking to a mailbox to mail it. Because contrary to the cliche, it isn't really the thought that counts, but the effort, which is to say the inconvenience. When you render the process more convenient, you drain it of its meaning. The venture capitalist and Reddit co-founder, Alex Ohanian, has observed that we often don't even realize something is broken until someone else shows us a better way. But the other reason we might not realize some everyday process is broken is that it isn't broken to begin with, and that the inconvenience involved, which might look like brokenness from the outside, in fact embodies something essentially human. Frequently, the effect of convenience isn't just that a given activity starts to feel less valuable, but that we stop engaging in certain valuable activities together in favor of more convenient ones. Because you can stay at home, order food on Seamless, and watch sitcoms on Netflix, you find yourself doing so, though you might perfectly be well aware that you'd have had a better time had you kept your appointment to meet friends in the city or tried to make an interesting new recipe. I prefer to brew my coffee, the law professor Tim Wu writes in an essay on the pitfalls of convenience culture. But Starbucks Instant is so convenient I hardly do what I prefer. Meanwhile, those aspects of life that resist being made to run more smoothly start to seem repellent. When you can skip the line and buy concert tickets on your phone, Wu points out, waiting in line to vote in an election is irritating. As convenience colonizes everyday life, activities gradually sort themselves into two types, the kind that are now far more convenient, but that feel empty or out of sync with our true preferences, and the kind that now seem intensely annoying because of how inconvenient they remain. Resisting all this as an individual or as a family takes fortitude, because the smoother life gets, the more perverse you'll seem if you insist on maintaining the rough edges by choosing the inconvenient way of doing things. Get rid of your smartphone, quit using Google, or choose snail mail over WhatsApp, and people are increasingly likely to question your sanity. Still, it can be done. The Bible scholar and agriculturalist Sylvie Kiesmont abandoned a full-time university position in Toronto because she was following a hunch that her overwhelmed life and the efficiencies and conveniences it seemed to necessitate were somehow undermining its meaning. She moved with her husband and children to a farm in the vast swath of the Canadian interior known as the Land Between, where each winter day begins by lighting the fire that will warm the farmhouse and provide heat for cooking. She writes, "Every morning I carefully scrape out the ash of yesterday. As I lay the kindling and listen for the crackling of wood-devouring flame, I wait. The house is cool, and all I have to do for the next few minutes is be attentive and patient. The fire needs time to build, needs to be fed and nurtured into the strength of heat for cooking. If I walk away and leave it, it will die. If I forget to pay attention, it will die. Of course, being fire, if I build it too big and forget to pay attention, I could die. Why take the chance?" Someone asked me how long it takes before I have my first hot cup of tea in the morning. Well, let's see. In the winter, I light the fire, sweep the floor, and wake the kids for chores. I run water for the cows, get them some hay, give the chickens some grain and their water, feed the ducks. Sometimes I help the kids with the horses and barn cats and then come back in. Then I put the kettle on. Maybe I get something to drink within an hour of waking. If things go well, an hour. End quote. We needn't dwell here on whether Kismont's new, self-consciously inconvenient way of life is intrinsically superior to the kind with central heating, take-out food, and twice-daily commutes. Although I think perhaps it might be. Her days do seem busy and exactly that agreeable, non-overwhelmed, Richard Scarry's sense of the word. And obviously not everyone has the option of pursuing precisely her sort of path, but the real point is that her decision to make such a radical change arose from the recognition that she never managed to build a more meaningful life, which for her meant cultivating a more mindful relationship with her family's physical surroundings, by saving time and thereby squeezing more into her existing one. To make time for what mattered, she needed to give things up. Convenience culture seduces us into imagining that we might find room for everything important by eliminating only life's tedious tasks, but it's a lie. You have to choose a few things, sacrifice everything else, and deal with the inevitable sense of loss that results. Kismont chose building fires and growing food for her children. How else are we to get to know this place where we have been set, apart from tending to it, she writes. Outside of planting the food we eat, how are we to learn the living character of soil, the various needs of peppers, lettuce, and kale? You might make a very different choice, of course, but the undodgeable reality of a finite human life is that you are going to have to choose.